Hello, and welcome to Circana Inspire webinar. Today's topic will be from growth to transformation, a global private label perspective. I'm extremely honored to be presenting this thought leadership with a couple of colleagues from our Circana's CPG and Food Service Advisory. My name is Sally Lyons Wyatt, and I am the Global Chief Advisor. I am joined today by Ananda Roy, who leads our EMEA CPG and Food Service Advisory. And we'll also hear from one of our colleagues, Dan Bone from Australia, who's also part of the advisory. Dan won't be presenting live since it's the middle of the night in Australia, but he did record some thoughts for us to consider as we think about the global implications of private labels. What we're presenting today gives a high-level overview of what is happening in 3 areas around the world. We do understand that this is not an exhaustive view, but it will provide insights regarding what's occurring similarly and differently in these different regions. For the purposes of this research, we recognize retailer-owned brands as either private brands, private labels, or store brands, and you'll see that we've used these terms interchangeably throughout the webinar. We will welcome questions. There is a Q&A section on the console. Please feel free to put your questions in. We will try to address as many as we can at the end, but we will also have a record of them that we can then reply back via email post the webinar. Now, just to give you a grounding of some of the key insights, and then we're going to dive deeper into these, but private brands are competitive forces in CPG with more to come. They're just kind of getting that journey accelerated. You will see that private brands are at different life stages, but yet all firmly established in CPG, with retailers driving their transformation beyond price. In the European countries, private label is mature. It's 39% value, 47% unit share. In the US, it's more emerging now, with 22% value and 24% unit share. And yet, it's the fastest growing with $306 billion in US sales. There is a mixture of growth as inflation has eased. Gains remain strong in the US, Spain, and France, but other countries have slowed. When we looked at the top 10 fastest growing private brand segments around the world, we found that private brands have maintained their price gaps to name brands in all the regions. In Europe and Australia, name brands have leveraged promotions more heavily than private brands. In fact, as much as 3 times more. Name brand volume is on deal versus store brands. Retailers are investing in creating equity, driving innovation, sustainability, differentiation, and premiumization. You will hear us say this today, but in every region, private brands are going beyond simply playing on price and promotions. So where might private brands extend given this growth? Well, there's approximately 18% of CPG unit sales in each region that's vulnerable for additional gains from private labels. Among the top 3 vulnerable categories are things like everyday staples, foods in the US and in Europe, and non-food in Australia. But make no mistake, this growth did not happen overnight. It took time. You can see how the labels and the brands have evolved over the past 45 years, from generic, low cost, and undifferentiated copies of mainstream products to more modern and highly competitive products today. These competitive products are hitting the right mixture of consumer-focused, strategy-obsessed, unique, and data-inspired products. So Ananda, let's now start diving into our insights.
Thank you, Sally. Private labels have become quite firmly established in the global CPG markets, and we've seen significant growth because of significant and consistent investment that retailers are making. On this slide, you see the 3 key regions in our study. In the center, we're looking at Europe, where 39% of Euro share, value share of FMCG sales is in private labels. Now, that's been growing at about 3.4% versus the previous year, taking it to about 268 billion euros in sales. On the left, you see the US, 22% of dollar share of FMCG or CPG sales. That has been growing at about 4.6%, so really significant growth, taking it to $308 billion in sales. Now, in both of these cases, there has been growth. You are seeing dollar share change versus the previous year go up by at least 4 points. Compare that to Australia, which has quite a significant Australian dollar share of the CPG sales. It's about 36%. And that has grown at 4.8% as well. So what we're trying to show you across this this map of the world, shall we say, is that there is a consistency. There is a consistency across global CPG markets, and this is the beginning of a trend that we expect will continue in future years as well. Now, private labels have gained share during periods of high inflation. We've seen significantly in the US, in Europe, as well as in Australia, that as inflation began to hit double digits, that is when you saw the significant growth of private labels come through. But what is notable, what is interesting, is that even as that has eased, even as inflation has eased, you are seeing the unit share continue to grow. And what is really remarkable, as inflation has begun to creep up again in the last 13 weeks, we see that that growth continues abated, which suggests that there is more room to grow. Now, the reason for this, and it's a point that Sally made well, is not pricing and promotion alone. This is because the growth has really been driven by retailers who are investing in this transformation and have been doing so for decades. They are incredibly strategy obsessed. They're constantly evaluating category dynamics, looking at white spaces or areas of margin and volume focus. They're looking at range discipline. They're looking at products that are incredibly innovative and differentiated. Product portfolios are now often sustainable. They deliver against claims they have in food and beverage, very high quality and taste, and they're quite innovative. Retailers are also increasingly consumer focused. They are using their shopper panel data extensively, particularly mining loyalty data, and re-looking at their shopper segmentation every 6 months. One of the things I advise my clients is, if you haven't looked at your consumer and shopper segmentation in the last 6 months to a year, you're really missing an opportunity. And finally, retailers are incredibly data-driven. They are looking at demand forecasting so that they can reduce waste. Pricing and promotion analytics, particularly promotion effectiveness and identifying the optimal price points and price gaps to national brands, is critical. And of course, a point that I've made earlier is the range discipline. The retailers are constantly evaluating both the range and assortment of their portfolio. Now, retailer strategies vary across the regions to drive this growth. There is no single uniform strategy. So what we're seeing on this chart is the value share of private labels across the key global markets: Australia, France, Germany, Italy, Netherlands, Spain, UK, and the US. These are some of the world's largest grocery markets. And what we find very clearly is that, particularly in markets like Germany and Spain, there is a very high prevalence of private labels. But when you look at growth in particular, you see that in Spain, that growth has been driven by expanding store estates. You are seeing significant smaller format stores in residential areas, in downtown office areas, and so on. You're also seeing range expansion, particularly driven by innovation and EDLP, everyday low prices rather than promotions. And that's the story for Spain. In France, it's really about range expansion and a retailer push, where supermarkets and discounters, value grocery, are competing in the market. And then, of course, that contrasts very well with the US, which is really driven by new launches. Sally?
Thanks, Ananda. Appreciate you taking us through that. And now what I would like to do is kind of take a deeper dive into CPG breaks of food and beverage versus non-food share shifts that we see some interesting insights to share with you. The most recent growth has come from food and beverages, while non-food is feeling the competitive actions from name brands. For non-foods, you can see the share shift declines after the share shifts were very strong for Australia and Europe, especially in the compounded annual growth rate. In the US, branded manufacturers have found ways to capture consumer dollars through differentiated, multi-benefit, and socially engaging products. We have found these to be predominantly in mass beauty, home care, and pet care. USA's growth in food and beverages has accelerated over the past quarters, but specifically the last quarter of 2024. And that was interesting because it is a little more strong than the full year, suggesting the actions of the retailers are working with the consumers during the compounded macroeconomic period that we're working in today. Australia is a little less clear-cut than elsewhere, partially influenced by COVID and inflation cycle being 8 to 12 months behind Europe and United States, and the fact that private label underperformed more generally during the pandemic. On this page, you're actually looking at unit sales across the past couple of years. You'll see private label in the pink line and name brands with the purple line. You will see that USA and Europe follow a very similar trend between name brands and private label. Europe is seeing name brands fighting back, and while we see a similar situation in the US, it's not as pronounced at this time. Australia has several insights from the past couple of years. Firstly, name brands and private labels were cycling during lockdowns from Q3 2021. They were slower to emerge out of COVID restrictions because, unlike the US and Europe, they had a COVID avoidance strategy in place. In addition, name brands have invested heavily in price and promotion in recent quarters, as well as cycling weaker performance in the prior year. That was to be able to maintain their competitiveness with private label. We are diving a bit further on this page by looking at channel dynamics. And there was a question in the Q&A of, do we include club? The answer was yes. And here's where you start to see the channel dynamics. But I first want to ground us in definitions. We have the US and an aggregate of the 6 European countries that Ananda shared earlier. Supermarkets in Europe are the larger multiple type stores that sell food, beverages, non-food. They have a deli, bakery, floral departments, amongst others. This is the same as US traditional grocery. We've also split out, though in the US, traditional grocery with value grocers like an Aldi, for example, into value grocery that aligns with discounters in Europe. Hypermarkets in Europe are similar to club and mass in the US, serving up larger and bulk sizes to consumers. Convenience is small format with some petrol and or food forward type establishments. But for the purposes of this page, we did not include convenience on the US side because the majority of growth is coming from club and mass retailers. At the bottom, you see 2 rows. One shows the value share within the channel, and the other shows the value share within the region. Very purposely so, because they give you different insights. What we see is that the growth of private label within the omni-channel, so think of it being club private label sales divided by omni-channel private label sales. Therefore, you'll see similarities between food and non-food because it's more reflecting of the channel's momentum. In the US, traditional grocery, then mass, followed by club are the main sources for private label share. However, traditional grocery is losing share to club and mass. The highest value share gain versus a year ago is in the club channel for both food and non-food categories, reflecting retailers' push to gain fair share. In Europe, supermarkets and discounters are the key driving channels for private labels, especially in the all-important food and beverage categories. Supermarkets have 49% private label value share in food and beverage. and 31% in discounters for food and beverage. However, value share gain has been in supermarkets, whereas discounters have lost both food and beverage and non-food share over the last year. So you can see there's not a silver bullet to channels. In fact, the stories are very different between the regions. And we also think that this is going to be one of the answers. There was a question in the Q&A about, will we see the US reach similar value shares as Europe in the coming future? We're going to give it a little bit of a peek to our point of view a little bit later, but channel dynamic is absolutely part of the answer. As we look at food and beverage price per volume, compounded annual growth rates indexed to name brands, we find the price gaps have remained relatively the same, with a 20% plus discount in average prices. Interestingly, the only region where we see private brands outpace name brands is in Europe. Given the compounded pricing since 2022, this is due in part to a combination of what consumers are buying, where they're purchasing from, and the sizes they are consuming. So again, when you're purchasing the large sizes versus a small size, it impacts your turns, depends on who you are, and also where and how you're consuming, whether that's a food or a non-food. In the US, private brands positioning is similar across food and mass. However, the retailers are innovating across price tiers. So we've found value more of a kind of a middle or mainstream, and then also premium, which is also driving the neck and neck dollar growth between both private and name brands. Bottom line, private label has not relied solely on price gaps to grow. So what else have they used? Have they depended on promotions to grow? Well, as you can see here, the answer is quite simply no. However, since we are researchers, we want to tell you a little bit more, because it depends on the retailer strategy between high-low or EDLP practices. As before, purple line is name brands and the pink is private label. And we are measuring percent units sold on promotion. And as we move across the regions, you find that private label closely follows name brand promotional levels in the US. One driver is the diversity in the US of EDLP and high-low retailers. As we look at Europe, you can see that the name brands have doubled unit share on promotional activity, as it is approximately 34%. And we've increased promotions in the latest 13 weeks compared to private brands at 15% promo share. And they're reducing promotions, effectively widening the promotion gap. Australia shows a different story, with name brands relying on promotions, while private brands are generally EDLP, as you can see, with that huge delineation between private brands on promotion versus name. It very much spells out the two big players there are EDLP, and it absolutely shows up here. So Ananda, please share what we've seen with department impacts next.
Thank you. So what we see in departments is that there is no one department that's driving the most private label share. The answer really is across these big regions, these big markets. It really depends on where that growth comes. Commonly, it aligns to the local consumer needs and opportunities. So for example, on this slide to the left, we have the private label value share in the US in the last 52 weeks across some of the biggest departments where we have seen growth. And what you see very clearly is that dairy, proteins, bakery, kitchen and paper towels, those are some of the categories, or the segments rather, that were driving some of the significant private label growth. Not surprisingly, you are seeing these same commodity staples, both in the EU6 markets and Australia, amongst the highest private label value share. But then there are some differences. So when you see produce as an example, and there was a question in the chat about produce. Produce is included in the food and beverage data. Produce is very interesting because in the EU6, 42% of value share and growing is in produce. It's as high as 63% in Australia, but it is underrepresented in the US. So produce is an example where it's much more prominent in both the EU6 and Australia. The reverse is true in something like health. Health, 19% private label value share in the US, but it's underrepresented in the EU6, only about 15%, and significantly under fair share in Australia. So it really depends on the underlying consumer needs and opportunities. Retailers are incredibly focused on stepping up assortment via additional functional benefits, fun flavor combinations, culinary co-licensing with restaurants, and several other actions that have helped drive this growth. We have also seen some actions driving share within frozen and center store products. Moving on, we've seen retailers invest in private label equity beyond price to establish them as innovative, exciting, even aspirational in some cases, with premium alternatives to name brands. So, for example, in the US, from premiumization and trend-forward innovation, elevated culinary experiences, and a real push for sustainability, to masked brands, quick commerce, and super premium ranges in EMEA, and lifestyle brands, functional dosing, and cafe-style breakfasts at home in Australia. Many examples where private labels are now becoming both aspirational and exciting beyond price and promotion. In the US specifically, what we're seeing is retailers are leaning into innovation across price tiers, from sustainably sourced products to elevated culinary experiences on a budget and functional health and wellness, none of which you would typically expect from a private label. And this is really broadening consumers' appetites from unexpected innovations. EU retailers, on the other hand, are using a variety of strategies to accelerate growth. We are seeing some remarkable initiatives to really make differentiation stand out distinctively in a very crowded marketplace. For example, from recruiting Michelin star chefs to develop their ready-to-eat meal portfolios, to creating food and non-food bundles timed to episodic TV content. So, we're seeing MasterChef episodes being linked to food and non-food bundles in supermarkets, to introducing functional ingredients across the food and beverage range, particularly things like high protein and gut health ingredients, and innovating in new routes to market, such as vending machines and other forms of direct-to-home delivery. Let's listen to what my colleague, Dan, in Australia thinks.
Thanks, Ananda. I know that the UK private label scene is always keenly observed from this region. I think it's a world-leading market in how premium tier, in particular, premium tier private label is constantly raising the bar. And there's plenty of overlap in what yourself and Sally have noted in terms of the growth themes internationally and what we're seeing in Australia. For example, high growth premium private label meals right now are being effectively pitched as restaurant quality alternatives, and that's at a time when Australians have been more reticent to spend in hospitality. So private label exists as a chance to trade up, even though people are trading out and down from eating out. We're seeing private label leveraging culinary and health trends, like overseas. Coles recently won a Product of the Year award for its overnight chia pudding. These products have been trending in local cafes and foodie social media. Perhaps more impactful, certainly in terms of sales and its cross-category influence, it's worth calling out the Coles Perform brand, sports dietitian approved lineup. That includes performance meals, high protein bars, and protein powders. And it's not just about specialized and premium private label. Yes, that's a trend certainly, but we've also seen great success of Coles Simply, a new sub-brand that was launched last year. It's a bit of a throwback to the private label of yesteryear. Very simple, sunny, bright yellow visual identity. It capitalizes on the fact that yellow and good value are pretty much synonymous in Australian grocery. The packs also visually pop within the category fixtures they exist, making it easy for Australians who are really focused on fixed dollar budgets at the moment to shop according to that budget. Seemingly, it resembles the Just Essential tier from Asda in the UK, which I know has performed very well as well. One interesting aspect of Coles Simply is it also features in the retailer's current collectibles activation, and actually in doing so exists alongside a number of high-profile participating national brands in the household product space. And you can see an example here of a floor graphic that brings together all of those participating brands, including private label. And that's indicative of private label and national brands, and a bit more of a crossover that we're seeing. The multi-year and award-winning collaboration between Woolworths, our largest grocery retailer, and Biscoff has certainly been a standout within bakery. Biscoff as a brand has doubled household penetration in the last 2 years and garnered cult status in doing so. So it makes sense for a retailer like Woolworths to elevate its private label offering by leveraging that brand's social currency. Victoria Coffee, a popular brand here, has also developed a range of branded capsules for Aldi's private label coffee machines, and that's indicative of the very fast-growing discounts, certainly through 2024, of starting to rely a little bit on national brands within its range mix. And finally, we're seeing some activations from food and beverage brands around cross-promotions. Just before Christmas, Coca-Cola partnered with Coles for a Coles-branded hot roast chicken and soft drink deal. Retail media, evidence here by digital front-of-store screens and in-aisle floor stickers, did a great job of drawing attention to that cross-promotion. So where does all this leave, or where does all this NPD and trade activation leave us? The ongoing research that we've done with our shopper panelists reveals that there's certainly higher acceptance of own label. 2/3 of Australians now agree that own label products are a good alternative to branded offerings, and that's up from 60% in 2021. The nice thing about our panel is we can look at the attitude, compare with the behaviour, and what we can see from the 25% who are most favourable towards own label is that they're buying an additional 126 private label items more than the average Australian shopper. In contrast, those holding less favourable attitudes are spending $5.7 per trip less on private label. So attitude is very much correlated with spend. When private label is seen as a viable alternative choice, it means that a high proportion of CPG name brand sales will continue to be vulnerable to private brands. And one interesting observation from our data across the regions is that the most vulnerable categories in 2024 differ by region. Shifts like this can be influenced by circumstances, especially product availability, of course, but also by the range development that creates new impetus for those intrigued, enthusiastic shoppers to buy something different. And with that said, I'm going to turn it back to Sally now, who's going to conclude this first part of this webinar series. Over to you, Sally.
Thanks, Dan. We thought it would be a good idea to dive a little bit deeper into the US, given we're not as mature as the other regions. And Dan is right. There are categories that are vulnerable. We actually found in a recent survey in the US that consumers are increasingly open to exploring new private label offerings. In fact, more so now than in the past. 28% of name brand loyalists state that they are trying a new private label for the first time in 3 months. On average, consumers are buying private label in 7 more categories in 2024 versus 2022. We've seen categories where name brands dominated, and consumers are really embracing private label with share growth across chocolate, sports drinks, and carbonated soft drinks and salty snacks. In fact, here's a few examples. So Walmart launched new sports drink line. It's going head to head with Gatorade after heavy price increases. Target launched favorite soda, a favorite day soda, capitalizing on premium and BFY soda trends. Walmart also invested in carbonated soft drink line, capitalizing on the rising name brand prices in prior years. So how, you might ask, are we going to have, as we've been discussing, it is having an option for consumers that deliver on taste, quality, price, and the overall experience. As you see here, leading US retailers have been launching new private label lines to defend and expand their consumer reach. Budget or value friendly with Kroger's Smart Way to higher end lines like Walmart's Better Goods. Even online pure plays are jumping in with companies like Amazon with their Amazon Saver line, which are essential grocery lines at affordable prices. Now, to draw this all together, I wanted to be able to let Ananda give you some insights to how this all and what this all means to you as we look across the regions, not deep within. Ananda?
Excellent. Our point of view on private label growth is very nuanced. What we can be sure is continued growth, but for different reasons across different regions. Now, what we try and do is take them one by one, and I'll try and compare and contrast. So what we're seeing particularly in Europe is that private labels continue to gain share, but at a lower or a slower rate. What you're seeing is supermarkets, or what we call mass in the US, are intensifying price matching, particularly to the value grocery chains. There is also significant range expansion. This is the opposite of range discipline that I spoke about earlier. They're expanding range quite significantly, especially in food and beverages. Discounters are expanding into small format stores. Discount chains or value grocery traditionally have been outside of towns, the large format stores. They are now moving into smaller format stores in residential areas, in downtown office areas. And this is really to drive not only value per trip, but frequency of purchase as well. Convenience is becoming a strategic channel, particularly to drive premiumization. And you're also seeing a lot of innovation in merchandising and vending. And finally, brands are being able to take a much more proactive stance in competing with private labels, mainly through innovation and promotion effectiveness using retail media. This was one of the questions in the chat. It's really brands taking the game to private labels through innovation and promotion effectiveness. Now, in Australia, it's again a story of growth, a marginal private label share gain as the cost of living crisis begins to abate. So what you're seeing is from the high double digits, you're beginning to draw down into much more realistic or pragmatic growth. But this is really tempered by the fact that consumer acceptance is beginning to grow greater than 70%. So you're seeing a combination of the on-trend innovation, greater assortment management and optimization, unwinding some of the highs in promotions. And that is making 2025 look a bit more challenging and drawing down some of that significant growth. Now, brands are, again, competing. They are increasing variety, particularly around price points, attributes, benefits. And they need to do that, otherwise private labels will. Now in the US, it's a story of continued growth trajectory, but from different places. So you are seeing, value channel has traditionally been a growth channel, but you're now seeing the development of mass and club as well. You're seeing large or mid-sized grocers make private labels a core pillar of their growth strategy. You're seeing evidence that retailers will make innovation central. Innovation expanding through localization, regionalization, unique partnerships, and finally, brands doubling down on innovation. One really interesting element across all three regions is that innovation is a proven source of organic demand. It is not the national brands that are leading innovations in every instance. In some cases, particularly in health and wellness, particularly in things like vitamins, minerals, and supplements, you are seeing private labels in some cases way ahead of national brands in terms of innovations and formulations. Now, in terms of the implications, clearly the retailers are expected to take a much more consumer-first approach to guide their strategic choices and their investments to accelerate growth. So there are a range of things that we're expecting them to do. The top 5 things are from building distinctive brands with reputation for quality and reinforcing sustainability. This is really about creating brand equity and communicating effectively, especially through the use of social media and other digital channels. Knowing and prioritizing the future shopper. The first step is updating and sharpening shopper segmentation, as I mentioned earlier, to better identify pain points and to be able to drive loyalty by cohort. The third area is monitoring emerging trends to drive trial and loyalty, starting with consumer need states and then sharpening in-store merchandising and building solutions, especially around occasions. Dynamic and flexible pricing, taking advantage of strategic price gaps, is crucial. This is where the role of pricing and promotion analytics, especially as you take on the broad price elasticities and cross-price elasticities, is important, and especially when you're now beginning to make investing quite large amounts of pricing in various kinds of promotion support. And ultimately, it's about executing effectively, really reducing time to market, sourcing locally, staying ahead of the competitors through investing in both existing and new private labels in the portfolio. Sally?
Thank you, Ananda. And now, if you're a brand manufacturer, there are several ways that you can compete with positive impacts, and we've been seeing it. If you have the ability to help grow the category, retailers are going to listen and potentially accept your new products. Develop leading features, consider blurring boundaries, and nurture excitement, especially for the consumer and the retailer, to help them see how you're going to drive traffic into their stores. This will ultimately help you defend your shelf space as well. Have a revenue growth management practice of optimizing your portfolio price, packs, and assortment optimization. Maintain entry level and value pack pricing and consider supporting these with a multi-tier pricing strategy that will really create more strategic price gaps between you and private brands. Connect with consumers via brand equity and communication. You need to win the storytelling around solutions and occasions. Encourage experiences and build emotional connections. Collaborating with retailers is important, especially for in-store execution and trade effectiveness where applicable. Promote solutions with private labels and targeted discounts. If possible, consider retailer exclusives, ultimately to maintain brand visibility with impactful placements. Lastly, ensure your product will meet and or exceed consumer expectations. You want to strive for unique benefits that can then justly justify some price points. Stimulate new occasions and emphasize quality and trust. I know we've said that about occasions, but consumers buy for occasions. They don't buy necessarily for categories or specific products. So think about what you ladder up to. Do you ladder up to a meal occasion, a snack occasion, a special moment occasion, a holiday occasion, whatever that might be? Definitely think about how you can leverage your portfolio to meet the needs of consumers. Now I'm going to pause because we do have time to answer some questions. So I'm just going to leave this page up and really kind of zero in on some of these questions. So Ananda, you can get ready because we're going to share these. From Mark DeAngelis, are brands doing anything differently when they're competing against one brand and private label? For example, where these two own 90% of the total category share. So Ananda, I would love for you to take that.
Yeah, very interesting question, particularly in countries like Germany and Spain, where there is a very, very high prevalence of private labels and one other brand. If you're in those kinds of markets, all options are on the table. And we have seen some excellent examples from Protein brand, where collaborating with the retailers is strategically a great option if you're the number 2 or the number 3 player in the market. And collaborating with the retailer means, of course, becoming an own label supplier, but also maintaining a portfolio which is differentiated from your own label business. So, there are a range of things that are prevalent in markets, collaborating with retailers. The other one, of course, is if you're a strong brand, growing the category rather than just fighting for volume share within an existing category is really something that brands have a license to do. This is all about putting the consumer first, identifying new need states, new occasions that you can build your portfolio against, using available data from retailers, but also partners like us who give you a sense of where shopper loyalty is going, what are the pricing opportunities that you can take advantage of to compete with both the private label and the other big player. So there are a range of options. It requires a different strategy if you're in that particular predicament.
Thank you. All right, from Victor, are name brands packaging private label for retailers? I'll take this. The answer is there's a mixture. So there are some manufacturers that do indeed co-license and co-brand or co-manufacture, excuse me, private labels. But what's interesting is some retailers, especially the big guys, will have multiple manufacturing facilities for their private brands around the world, just given regional expertise, regional abilities, etc. So there is a mixture. There's some that do their own. There's some that leverage co-branding and co-manufacturing with name brand companies. Another question is, which categories do you think are more resistant to private label growth in the US? We will get back to you, Olivia, with more, but I will tell you there are some, like confections, that have really kind of been very resistant because consumers love their favorite candy brand or even some of the emerging brands there. So that is one that I wanted to highlight, but we'll get back to you with a few more. The other question was what falls into health. In the US, that is mass beauty, health care, so think analgesics, etc., home care, pet care, and then some CPG general merch that falls into that.
Pretty much the same in Europe.
Awesome. One question was around the convenience channel and why it was missing on the channel page. We mentioned it when we presented, but the convenience channel had a rough year in 24, so they're not driving private label growth. They do have private label. If you are around next Tuesday, we will do a deep dive into the US and you'll see a little bit more during that conversation. All right, let's go to, does the percent numbers represent prepared food to as private label or only packaged food? So Ananda, I'll let you take that one.
It includes both. So ready-to-eat meals, prepared foods, and packaged foods are all put into the edible category for the purposes of the analysis.
Awesome. Then there is, where does .com fall in the data? You want to take that?
In Europe, in Europe, .com data is very patchy because we have a very fragmented .com retail landscape. You have folks who have quick service delivery. They deliver direct to home via apps. You have, of course, more traditional click and collect type delivery. So we have excluded .com from this particular analysis in Europe. We don't believe it changes the direction of the insight in any way, but we have excluded it from this particular analysis.
And for the US, .com, when it is, if it's a third party, so an Uber Eats or something like that in the US, it is still, if it's sourced from the retailer, it's within these numbers you're looking at. We do look at online, so pure plays. So that is within our omni-channel. But again, for the purposes to align to the other regions, we didn't highlight that. We will, however, be highlighting that next Tuesday in our US deep dive. All right, so let's see. Where does the pet category fit in? Ananda, you want to field that? I think we had a conversation. Do you want to field that question?
Yeah, so the pet category is in our non-edibles analysis. So we don't include it with food as in human food. We've stuck it all in the non-edibles side of the analysis.
Fabulous. Let's see. We talked about fresh produce is included in food, so we covered that. The value share is actually what in the US, that would be dollars. In Europe, that's going to be euro, etc. So we have noted in here when you look at the deck, whether you're looking at value or you're looking at unit. Oh, this is a good one for you, Ananda. How is range discipline defined?
So range discipline is in two ways. One is, of course, you are making sure that you are constantly looking at your portfolio and removing the long tail, and incredibly focused on those SKUs that have a certain rate of sale that you've agreed is the minimum you require. So one approach is to simply remove the long tail and focus on the runners. The second approach, of course, is to benchmark yourself with the competition. So especially in the food and beverage category, it's really important to make sure that you are looking at some of the retail KPIs around conversion rates and access rates, your ability to serve a certain part of the department with a certain level of quality, whether it's minutes or the amount of store clerks who are able to serve. Now, if you have a very wide range, you are spreading yourself thin. So different retailers in Europe have different ways of looking at range discipline. It could be as simple as focus on very, very small set of items and assortments. And it could get more sophisticated, where you're looking at not only the actual stuff that's available on shelf, but also how you serve customers who walk through the door.
Thank you. Another one for you. Which categories in Europe are more resistant to shoppers migrating to private label? Sorry.
So the categories that are most resistant, no surprise, are the high image-driven categories. So baby food, alcohol, confectionery, and so on. Those are the most resilient. We are also seeing an element of resilience in categories like ambient snacks. And that's because of the significant amount of innovation that we're seeing in that space. Brands are really increasing the launch velocity of new products, new occasions, a whole range of interesting propositions. There is some activity and therefore some resilience in sports and energy drinks. And that again goes to the same point where brands step up and bring in trend-forward innovation. That's when you begin to take on private labels. This is very much a feature in Australia as well, where you see image-driven categories where brands are able to commercialize their equity and deliver innovation. That's where private labels take a back step.
All right, one more for you, and then I'll do one more, and then we're going to roll this to the end. But Ananda, do you think if inflation rates drop significantly that shoppers will shift back to brands?
No, this is a very good question. I get asked this all the time. Absolutely not. I think a key message through this presentation has been that the growth of private labels is beyond price and promotions. Putting the growth down to down trading as an oversimplification. We also saw a slide where as inflation has begun to ease, private label unit share growth has continued to grow. And this is because retailers have been investing in this transformation for decades. It's all about quality, sustainability, taste, delivering claims. We had a whole range of examples where they're investing in equity. So we are seeing a greater amount of acceptance. In Australia, as high as 70% acceptance of private labels. So the answer is very, very simple. We are going to see the growth of private labels continue, but at a slower rate.
And the last question, and by the way, I wanted to say from a US perspective, I think we're going to see a combination of both. I think you're going to see consumers that stick with the brands that they've begun to be loyal to from a retailer perspective. I think that it's going to really be dictated by what is the distinctiveness and differentiation between branded and private label and what's valued by the consumer. And value means different things to different people. So I think you're going to see a mixture in the US. But I do feel that this is a different time for private label than in past, per what Ananda talked about. They've really started to entrench themselves with consumers, gotten them loyal onto their own brands. But we're a very finicky bunch in the US. So if indeed we see something that catches our eye that's innovative and engaging and captive and it's from a name brand, I just might go try that. So I think you're going to see a combination of both in the US. So I am going to get us to really talking about, we leverage several solutions to bring you these insights today. We hope you found them valuable to you and your company. If you've been online and you're still here, you may have noticed you can download the copy of the presentation from the console. So feel free to do that. If you're listening to the recording, then you will be able to get an email that will provide you with the link as well. And then I just want to say thank you so much for joining us today. On behalf of Ananda, Dan, and myself, we are appreciative to your valuable time. Look forward to connecting and continuing our conversation with you. In fact, we have the US Deep Dive that I've only mentioned now twice. This is the third time next Tuesday if you want to be interested to learn more. And you can also learn more by scanning the QR code. Until then, we hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day. Cheers, everyone.
Thank you.